a couple people after Mass came up to me and they said, "I don't like that you're presenting on marriage." I was like, "Oh, I'm sorry," And they said, "I don't believe in annulments," and I said, "I'm sorry. I mean, I don't know." And they're like, "You shouldn't either." And I said, "I'm a priest, and so I'm obedient to the bishop and to this juridical process, but I am aware that this can be a emotional topic for some people, and so I want to acknowledge that first. I want to talk in this first session about what the Catholic Church defines marriage to be. It's very specific, it's very precise. You probably know a lot of this, or may have forgotten that you know it. However, I would argue that people my age or younger do not necessarily know all of this. If you think about how much things have changed in the world, even in just 50 years or 100 years, my grandparents were saying that they could not get married unless they both were Catholic. This idea of like mixed marriages was not something that they grew up with. And if one of them loved the other, they would have to convert. And whole families could have been split apart by that. There was also kind of an overlap, if you think of a Venn diagram, of the culture's understanding of marriage and church understanding of marriage. And that Venn diagram seems to be separating more and more and more every year. So a lot of young people, like my younger sister, she doesn't see the point of getting married. And she's Catholic. She grew up with my family that's pretty Catholic. I mean, I would argue that I'm pretty Catholic. And but still, she just says, what does it do? And I don't know. I think that there's a loss somehow in that somehow she made it through youth group and Catholic education and everything, and then still, she doesn't have a big love for marriage. And then a lot of people find it to be very confusing because the definitions seem to change in the legal framework of our society and in other countries. So I want to talk about the basics. That's why it's called Foundations of Faith, I guess, going really back to the basics. And I'm going to assume, I'm just going to start from the very, very, very beginning with terms and things like that and build up from there. As always, we begin with an opening prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, as we dive into this topic tonight, celebrating marriage as a sacrament, celebrating marriage as an invitation into the love of the Trinity, and manifesting that love, expressing that love to other people. We ask you, Lord, to bless all of those who are discerning marriage, all couples. We ask for all of those who have undergone painful divorces or separations, all of those who have lost their loved ones and continue to miss them, and especially for young people who very often, especially in the last few years, have expressed to me that they have felt alone and how difficult it is for them to find a partner that shares in their faith and that they want to spend their life with. We pray, Lord, that you console them and allow them to experience the depth of your love through Christ our Lord. Amen. Why me? This is a question that I ask often in my life about many things. So why me? Why am I presenting this to you and not, I don't know, a married couple? Father Larry found this out. It's not something I like to necessarily wear on my sleeves. But he found out that I studied canon law after being ordained as a priest. And that I worked in the tribunal for a while. The tribunal would be the department of the diocese that adjudicates marriages. It sounds very fancy. It's essentially like a DMV. It's just paperwork and stuff. But I will say I've always been interested in marriage ministry as a priest. Even when I was first ordained, even as a deacon, I've always loved it. I've always loved meeting couples that are struggling, that are not struggling, that are preparing for marriage, that are going through divorce. I just think it's a great place of encounter with people. And there's no time for platitudes. There's no time for anything except serious stuff. And I've had some of my best friendships come out of marriage preparation. I also really consider it a privilege to walk with people through questions. And I'll say that sometimes in my life I've been kind of, the priest of last resort. So they've gone to one priest and the priest was mean, and then they've gone to the other priest and the other priest was like, I don't believe in this stuff. And then they've gone to someone else and then they finally are like, your last hope is Barry. If he can't help you out, then no one can. So I did, in the interest of full disclosure, ask for a break from tribunal work, because I think you can do it about 4 or 5 years before you really just start getting depressed, because a lot of it is reading for hours painful experiences that people are expressing over and over and over again, and it sneaks up on you. Now, the 3 guys that are in the tribunal now that came in after me, they love it. They love this stuff. They get excited every morning, I guess, to wake up and do annulments, so more power to them. And they are also, I would say, very passionate, like me, about trying to front load a lot of information about marriage on couples who are discerning so that that annulment doesn't happen. We'll go into kind of what a declaration of nullity is, kind of towards the end. But in brief, I don't really like the term annulment because it makes it sound like the church is doing something or erasing something. The actual formal term is a declaration of nullity, because a marriage lasts until the death of one of the spouse. In our tradition, and with what Jesus Christ said, the only way that you can help a couple who's struggling and may want to get married again is to say, okay, were there elements that were missing in the first place that didn't make it a full or complete marriage? Not their fault, not anyone else's fault. It doesn't mean that the relationship wasn't real. It doesn't have anything to do with the kids or anything like that. But is there something that they may have missed? And if so, can we sort of straighten that out so that in the next marriage, that relationship is stronger? You're all going to probably be experts at marriage by the time you leave, so be careful, because Father Larry may tap you to help in marriage ministry, sponsor couple, or being an advocate for the diocese. So if you are interested in that, please feel free to talk to me afterwards, because young couples really need, I think, good people to look up to and to guide them and to make good friendships with. So, what's the goal? What are we trying to get to? What does a good, quote-unquote, marriage look like? So I wrote this down. She lay quietly on her bed, staring out the window. Occasionally a moan escaped her lips, twisted downward at the corners by the same stroke which had immobilized her years before. Her husband entered the room, smiled, kissed her gently on the cheek, and repeated the words he'd spoken to her for 60 years. Honey, you look beautiful. I love you. Ever so softly, the expression on her face softened into a look of contentment and peace. So when I think of the term marriage, which is often so loaded, so misunderstood, so ill-defined, I think of a scene like this, and I've seen it multiple times as a priest, where people have invited me into their homes, and I've seen love that it has lasted and is beautiful. It doesn't negate the fact that some people don't have this, but I think when I see it, it's inspiring. The church has 7 sacraments, and they're kind of divided into categories. The first being initiation, which you probably know from Catholic school, or a nun hitting you with a ruler or something. You have to memorize it. That's baptism, Eucharist, and confirmation. And there are sacraments of healing: spiritual healing with reconciliation or confession, and physical healing with anointing of the sick. The last two sacraments are meant to build up the church and be at service to the entire church. Holy orders, so priesthood, diaconate, the episcopacy or the bishopric, and marriage. A lot of people, I don't think, realize that marriage as a sacrament is meant to inspire people that true love can exist. Not necessarily love that's based on emotions, but a committed love. Through thick or thin, through better or for worse. And hopefully, through this presentation, I'm going to argue that it's precisely within that relationship, and really only within that relationship, that someone can be vulnerable and truly known by another person, knowing that they won't bail out on them at any time, knowing that even if they don't necessarily feel in love at the moment, they made a commitment to this person and they're tied together. And it's them against whatever life throws at them, not necessarily them and life against the other person. And when you're able to enter into that reality, you have a better chance at the end of the twilight years of our life having a relationship that looks something like this. So what makes a marriage? Depends on who you ask, and I'm going to say where you ask. And we could survey all kinds of cultures in all kinds of times and do like an anthropology of marriage, because every culture seems to have some kind of embodiment of marriage. Different rules, different regulations, different understandings, but it seems to be something uniquely human in our DNA. And there are books and books and books. JD was telling me about one of them that's like this thick, that is just a survey of the history of marriage from like the beginning of time to now. And I don't think we necessarily need to go through that, but I'm going to talk a little bit about what marriage was like for the early Christians and some of the tensions that they faced in the midst of trying to live out their understanding of it in the midst of the Roman Empire and the secular world. I think that that's something that is in common with what we're dealing with now as Christians. How do we live out marriage? How do we make it special? How do we love it and show that love to a world that just doesn't seem to really even care? It's not even, I think, when I'm talking to younger people, it's not even that they're like against marriage or they think it's stupid or anything like that. It's almost worse. It's apathy. It's, I don't see what this does for me, aside from maybe tax benefits or something. Why do I need to do a ceremony to live with someone and care about someone? So, it's a lot of getting back to the basics. I think even among us as Catholic Christians, I think sometimes we assume, and the best of us assume, that the people in the pews really know what we're talking about when we talk about marriage, but I'm learning more and more and more that, again, that's not an assumption that I can make. So, in the midst of the culture defining marriage however they want, between two people, not necessarily a man and a woman, there's been some debate in the church to say, well, that word is lost to us. Like marriage has been taken over. Kind of like the rainbow. Like the rainbow is no longer like a Christian symbol. It was taken over and kind of redefined, and so we lost the rainbow as a covenant. So we've lost marriage. Marriage is too loaded of a word. It's too charged of a word. So let's just call it matrimony. So what they did is set a new order, and it recently came out, and I think it was 2013, the translation for marriage, for the rite of marriage. It used to be called the rite of marriage. Now what we use as priests or deacons is called the order of celebrating matrimony. And it's this attempt to kind of say, maybe we can make a new word that describes what we're talking about when we talk about Christian marriage. To me, I don't know. I think that they can be used pretty interchangeably. I think marriage has kind of a broader tone to it. It can be both secular or religious. Matrimony tends to be more religious. But I don't think that necessarily giving up the word marriage and switching it to another word is going to help. It's kind of like, I guess, rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, right? It makes you feel like you're doing something, but are you really doing something by just saying, I give up, let's start over again with a new word? The church sees marriage as a fundamental human right, present in the first pages of the Bible, something that's within our DNA, something that is natural for us. It is not good for man to be alone. That's why actually as a priest, people will say, isn't it like unnatural for you to not be married? And I'll say, yeah, it actually is. It's going against, you can say, the current, because what I'm supposed to embody at my best days, not all the time, is the fact that our eternal destination is in heaven with Christ. And I get to journey with people through their lives and help them to achieve that. It's the reason why, I don't know if you've ever noticed at the beginning of Mass, the priest will kiss the altar and then go. And the altar represents the people of God, the place where the sacrifice is. So it's kind of like kissing your wife good morning at the beginning of Mass and kissing her at the end. It's the priest kind of kissing the church. And then the deacons will do it too, and I'm like, man, but y'all are married too. But anyway, it's just a neat little tradition for the priest to come in and begin the Mass with an image of marriage. So Genesis, first few pages of the Bible, God blesses marriage in the very act of creation. The first marriage of history between Adam and Eve becomes the prototype of all married life. And it's interesting. Adam and Eve are a couple, a man and a woman. That was how God designed marriage to be. Now what happened with the Israelites is they were kind of like, maybe we can have polygamy as well. So you hear these stories of like Solomon and his many wives and concubines. Of Abraham kind of taking and having children with two women. But the ideal from the very beginning was a couple staying with each other, staying true to each other, staying committed to each other. And at times the people of God deviated from that. But Jesus is very strong and very stark when he makes these pronouncements, and he defends that from the very beginning of creation, God created man and woman to be together. The prophets will use marriage as a symbol for God's relationship to his people. One of my favorite books is the Book of Hosea, and it's kind of two-layered. It's kind of got a top layer and a bottom layer. The top layer is Hosea is married to a woman named Gomer, and Gomer leaves like every night to go be with another person. And it breaks his heart because he loves her and he can't stop loving her. And every night his prayer is that she'll just stay with him. It's where you get that famous song that a lot of people like at Mass. Come back to me with all your heart. Don't let fear keep us apart. So one of my favorite songs. And that bottom layer is basically, that's us with God whenever we sin or whenever we turn away or whenever we care about something more than him. It's like we're going out at night. And he says, I'm just waiting for you to come back. We're just waiting for you to come back. I love you so much. I won't ever leave you. Of course, in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, marriage is used in light of the exile and the return. So kind of in that same light as Hosea, the people of Israel were in exile and they returned back to God. God could not let them be in exile. He loves them so much. He made a commitment to them, and they made a commitment to him. Through thick or thin, better or for worse, they're going to get through this life together. And then that beautiful image in Isaiah. As a young man marries a young woman, so will your builder, your creator, marry you. As a bridegroom rejoices over his bride, so will your God rejoice over you. I think of that image of how, I don't know how many weddings I've celebrated since I've been ordained. It's a lot. It's a lot. I was at Emmaus, like most of you know, and that's like a wedding church because there's so many venues all around and it's so gorgeous. So almost every Saturday I had a wedding. And I will always, no matter how often I do it, I will always get taken aback by standing next to the groom as he sees his wife come in the first time in the dress, and he's like, wow. And that's why I like to be with the groom like 5 minutes before Mass. Usually the groom is here to my left, and then like the groomsmen and stuff. And then when it comes to everyone standing for the bride, I don't know, it's the expression on their face, on the guy's face is just, it's so awesome. And it never gets old, I guess. It never gets old to see that. And my prayer is that, I don't know, that same excitement and energy will last as an echo whenever he sees her. So wisdom literature, so Psalms, Proverbs, even into this, after the prophets, the practices of polygamy and divorce remain, but the ideal is more refined, and it begins to affect practice. So what I mean by that is, as you get closer and closer, kind of towards the end of the Old Testament, people have pretty much gone back to this idea of marriage being between one man and one woman permanently. However, there were lots of divorces, and you can have divorce for any reason. Typically, the guy could divorce the woman for any reason, and she needed like one super special, like the moon had to be in Pisces, and the sun in Aquarius or something, and then if everything lined up, the woman could divorce the man. But Jesus saw that and he was like, no, that's not good, that's not fair. One of my favorite wedding readings is the story of Tobias and Sarah. And what happens is, before their marriage, they kneel down in prayer. And Tobias says in his prayer, Lord, I take this woman not because of lust, but because of who she is. I love her. I love all of her. All of her. Not just a part of her, not just something that I want from her, not to be codependent or anything like that. But I love her in her entirety. And it's just a beautiful prayer. This is a broad swath, but this is kind of from my notes when I was in Washington, D.C. studying canon law. The Jewish people regarded marriage as pretty necessary. And there's a lot of pressure to get married and a lot of expectation to get married. And you even see it in the scriptures when someone loses a spouse. They're like, oh no, what do I do? I have no security, no safety. And they'll try to find someone else in the family to marry that person really quick. Not too close in the family, but close enough, in the family, to try to patch that up, because it was such a part of the social system. I don't know if this is true. I wish the rabbi was still here from the last couple classes, but my professor said an 18-year-old male not yet married could be ordered to marry by a court. Wow. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know if that would work nowadays. Girls could marry at 12 and a half years, boys at 13 years. And seems pretty young to me, but then you think about, of course, Mary being betrothed to Joseph at around the age of 15. Pretty normal. Also, people didn't typically live as long. I'm a believer that as life expectancy increases, kind of our stages of life increase. So kind of like people are now teenagers until they're 35, and they're still living with their parents until they're 40. And so, whereas I look at pictures of my grandparents' generation, and when you were 16, you already had your farm, you were working, you were starting to build a family, and it's interesting. And the principal purpose of marriage in the Jewish culture was to preserve the husband's family, to keep the clan and the tribe and the nation of the people of God in existence. And you'll hear in sacred scripture a lot of prescriptions that Jewish people do not marry outside of Judaism. Don't marry the Canaanite woman. Don't do this. And that has a very practical reason, is because typically, and we see it today, children will follow the faith of the mother. This is even before football and NFL and like stuff on Saturdays, but they knew over time that one of the ways to preserve a family would be for them to share the same faith. And that actually becomes an undercurrent for a lot of our marriage practice today. Oops. Yeah, so marriage among the Romans was essentially kind of the same, a little bit different, in that it was a means of transmission of property, making sure that you didn't lose anything and that it was all kind of kept within the family. And you can sort of see, I guess, the nascent mafia, in the Romans as, this is kind of where a lot of that stuff started about the family and the importance of family, and family is first, and you don't mess around with the family. So Roman marriage laws were relevant for questions concerning inheritance and status. Love, nice, if you could get it. Not required, which meant that there was a lot of infidelity. We'll just say that. And a lot of just kind of looking around and not asking, not telling, that kind of stuff. But you'll see this in the letters of Paul to Corinth and to different places, and he's saying, no, you and your marriage have to be different than the world. You have to stand up and exemplify the love of Christ for his church. So don't get caught in the ways of the world or make excuses. So there was this tension, even from early on, between the Romans, who were in control of the empire, and also the Jews, of course, but Christians, the early Christians, that new religion that was just beginning. It's interesting, I looked up some Roman jurists, so these would have been lawyers, and how they defined marriage in their courts. So the first is Domitius Ulpianus, and he said, marriage or matrimony is the joining of a man and a woman containing an undivided sharing of life. And there, I'm going to say that includes property and things like that. One man, one woman, and very simple definition. Very interesting to me that this next one, this man is not Christian, but he said marriage is a joining of a man and a woman and a consortium of the whole of life, a participation in divine and human law. So there was this sense, even among the Romans, that it was a sacred oath that you took in front of God or the gods, and that it was something special. So even within there's this tension between the ideal of what marriage was for them and the way that it was lived out, actually. So, big font, bold, because this is pretty important. Christ elevates marriage to a sacrament through the wedding at Cana, and also just through how he talked about it in the sacred scriptures. It's interesting that it's something that's pretty secular, pretty worldly, and he said, no, let me baptize this and make it something that's uniquely and beautifully Christian. The marriage covenant by which a man and a woman form with each other an intimate communion of life and love has been founded and endowed with its own special laws by the Creator. This is the definition of marriage in the Catechism. By its very nature, marriage is ordered to the good of the couple as well as to the generation and education of children. And Christ raised it to the dignity of a sacrament. So then we got to look back at what is a sacrament and review that. The phrase that's most used in Catholic world is outward signs of inward grace, instituted by Christ for our sanctification, and that's from St. Augustine. The way that I have always described sacraments to people, how I kind of understand it, is you have this sign, and what is a sign? It's a sign that points to something that's real. So for example, a stop sign points to the fact that if you don't stop, you can get a ticket. There's a real consequence to that. but it's something nebulous and kind of hard to define, so you need something that's a way to help you interpret what's going on. So it's an outward sign, kind of a top layer that's like a well that digs down into an aquifer of grace. And grace is essentially a gift from God to give us the power, the capacity to do things that we could not do on our own power or our own capacity. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. It's this idea of being found by God, and God giving us something, a gift, to live life in a better way than we could possibly do on our own. For the couple, every sacrament has what we call form and matter, and this is St. Thomas Aquinas for the most part. But it's always been a tradition that you need certain elements for something to work, and they need to be those specific elements. The Eucharist, for example. You need bread and wine. The Jesuits, being typically Jesuit, when they went to Japan, they started using rice cakes and sake, because the Japanese at that time didn't have much experience with wine or glutinous bread. So they used what was there. And Rome found out, and they said, no. Jesus instituted the Eucharist with wine and bread, not rice cakes and sake. And what's so interesting too is it has to be what we call true bread and true wine. So a lot of people will say that they want a gluten-free host. We can't actually give them a gluten-free host. There has to be some gluten in it, but it's like 0.0000001%. Right? And if a priest is alcoholic, he's allowed to use mustum instead of wine. However, what that mustum is, it begins fermentation for like a nanosecond, and then they stop it. So that there's like a very, very negligible, tiny amount of alcohol. But you can't use grape juice. It doesn't work. I can say the most beautiful prayers. I can do all of this stuff, but if I don't have the stuff, it doesn't work. So form and matter. So the matter of the Eucharist would be the bread and the wine. Matter stuff, the stuff. The form would be the words that I say. And I can't change those words around or do anything like that, or it doesn't work. What's interesting is for the couple in marriage, they celebrate the sacrament with each other. I don't do anything. I bless them. I record it. But what I do is witness the fact that they said their yeses to each other, their consent. So what you'll do if you see me marrying people, what I like to do is, instead of standing in the classical pose of them being in front of me and me doing the whole like marriage thing like you see in movies and stuff, I like to go down into the community, into the pews. I don't sit, but I stand with them, and I witness with everyone there that the couple is getting married, that they're exchanging their consent. And that's where you have the tradition of the maid or matron of honor, the bride and the bridesmaids and the groomsmen. I like to call them up whenever the couple is exchanging their consent, because they're literally witnessing the fact that these people said yes to each other. And I'll remind them, 2 years from now, 20 years from now, you witnessed their marriage. So if stuff is going on, you tell them, I was there when you said yes to this person. I remembered it. I witnessed it. And I will be with you and walk with you through whatever happens for the good of the marriage that you have. So to be selected as a witness at a marriage, I think, is a very beautiful thing and not something to take for granted. There's often a misconception about, do you have to be confirmed before you get married? The actual code says you should, if you can do so without serious inconvenience. Unfortunately, in the United States, serious inconvenience is a lot like the soccer schedule or things like that. But I know a lot of priests who went through school, and they make people get confirmed before getting married. They will not let them get married until they get confirmed, and they make them go through classes and all of that kind of stuff, because it's like, I don't know, it's like, we got to make them do it. We got to make them do it, even if they don't want to. And I always like to say, okay, work with them, love them, be with them, and then if they want to get confirmed and grow in their faith, awesome. But don't necessarily make more and more and more and more and more barriers, unless it's something that they're interested in and they want to do. So when I was in school, every so often it would come up in Rome that there would be a change to the code to get rid of that line, if you can do so without grave inconvenience, and to make everybody get confirmed. But baptism is the gateway to every other sacrament, not confirmation. If someone is baptized, I can hear their confession. If someone is not baptized, I can listen to them, but I can't absolve or anything. It's interesting. Also, if someone is Protestant but baptized, I can anoint them. I can give them the sacrament of anointing, because if anyone has a valid baptism, that's the gateway to any other sacrament, including marriage. When can marriages be celebrating? This is interesting. In the Catholic Church, any day but Sunday, thanks be to God. And I don't say that in vain. That would be awful. Good Friday and Holy Saturday. However, the bishop can grant permission for Sunday weddings. St. Augustine went through, let's just say, he was not a big fan necessarily of marriage as something beautiful when he was younger. He thought it was like, people are crazy, they're concupiscent, they can't have any kind of self-control. So I guess this institution exists so that people don't get too wild. That's kind of what he said. He didn't necessarily think it was something beautiful or honorable. And unfortunately, that kind of stuck with the church for a while. I think a little bit too long. There's a lot of good that Augustine did. I'm not going to knock him, he's a saint. But for years and years and years, there was this thought that the only way that you could be holy was to be like a priest or a sister or religious life. And everyone else, That's why, for centuries, you have all of these priest saints, religious sister saints, not really any married saints, until Pope John Paul II realized there's a big gap that's missing here. This quote, the church, I like this. This is romantic Augustine. He's a real winner. I think even if he didn't become a bishop, he would probably still be celibate. So, you, the church, subject women to their husbands in chaste and faithful obedience, not for the satisfaction of lust, but for the generation of children and for the association of domestic life. And then I love this line. Very nice. You set husbands over their wives, not to assume themselves at the expense of the weaker sex, but according to the laws of sincere love. So a lot of words there. But you can tell there just isn't this love for marriage as a way to be like a factory to produce saints. It was sort of dealt with like, Jesus made it a sacrament, so we're kind of stuck with that, but what do we do with it? And you don't really get a lot of growth in the understanding of marriage as a way to really grow in holiness until you start getting St. John Paul II and theology of the body, and this idea of marriage not being a remedy for our craziness or our inability to control ourselves, but marriage is a way to sanctify the other person in our relationship and bring each other closer to God. You see this a little bit in St. Paul as well. I typically think of St. Augustine as like St. Paul 2.0. He and St. Paul, I think, share a lot in common. But even in Paul, we'll talk about, if you have to get married, go ahead. It's better to not, because Christ is coming any day now. And to pursue holiness, you should focus on God and only on God. And don't let a human being distract you. So, Unfortunately, that stuck around in the church for a very, 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 very long time. The good news is that more and more every year, we're uncovering the beauty of marriage like a diamond. We're dusting it off like an archaeologist, and more unwrapping it and unraveling it, especially during a time when the world needs it the most. So this canonist, Isidore of Seville, in 636, so we're starting to move forward, says there's 3 reasons to take a wife. The first is for offspring, and he blessed them saying increase and multiply. The second is assistance. It's nice to have someone to help you do your laundry. And the third reason is self-restraint. So even in the 600s, that's just an example to show that marriage is like a Band-Aid. Which is sad. However, it's something that we're correcting. So, what does marriage look like in the civil world and the church world? And I like to use this term worlds because they're apart. There's some crossover, but they're actually more different. And what I guess I'll try to explain. So in the civil sense, marriage is a contract that's taken out usually under a governmental structure between 2 people, not necessarily male or female. It can be dissolved, not necessarily with any kind of religious affiliation, although there might be vestiges of it left over, like an appendix, that we don't necessarily know what it's for, but we still do stuff anyway. Like even in the secular marriage ceremony, they'll have a ring. And what does the ring signify? Eternity. So there's some belief in eternal life. It's weird. I would say in the United States it's very odd because of our tradition and our Judeo-Christian heritage. There's always been kind of an overlap between secular marriage and religious marriage, and also great pressure from society to keep married people together because it's good for the family, it's good for the town, it's good for the structure of the nation, helps people have morals, things like that. But you have a unique system that you don't have pretty much anywhere else in the world, in which the Catholic priest or deacon is both a civil authority and a religious authority. That doesn't take place pretty much anywhere else in the world. And what I mean by that is, like in Mexico, for example, you go to the judge and you get civilly married. You get all your state stuff taken care of. And then you go to church. And then you go to your priest and you say, we have this document. Will you bless this marriage or make it Catholic? So that's where you get that terminology from. Also in Italy, they do that as well. For us, it gets really kind of dicey because we're not so separate. And so when you had like Obergefell versus Hodges and gay marriage and things like that, there was this debate about what's going to happen. Will the government force the church to have to do something against its beliefs? Where you don't have that problem in any other country, because 2 guys can go up to a priest in Mexico and say, we have our civil license, and the priest will say, sorry, can't do anything with that. And there's no tension, no issue, because they have the legal right, but the church doesn't necessarily have to be pressed into that. But serving as both a civil authority, things get kind of messy. So I would say that my preference would be like that, for people to go to their civil authority, get a civil marriage, and then bring it over to the church. I think it works a lot better. Civil marriages have no effect in church world, so to speak. What I mean by that is, if a couple is married civilly and living together, the church just sees them as living together. They don't really see the document as meaning anything at all. That's why grandma is like, you better go to the church and get that fixed right now because you're living in sin, and you have to remedy that. Similarly, church marriages have no effect in the civil world. So they don't really touch each other. They're 2 different things entirely. Married in the eyes of God, 1 man and 1 woman, dissolved by death, can be a sacrament, and I'll get into that in a second. Not every Catholic marriage is a sacrament. It's interesting. It's kind of like rectangles and squares, and I'll talk about that. The sacrament of marriage is a covenant, which is more than a contract. And the church has really been trying to push this because for, I would say, the largest amount of years, the most years that we've existed as a church, probably 80% of the time we've existed as a church, the church has always kind of seen marriage as a contract. Something that helps people and handles property, but not necessarily as anything beyond that. So the church has really been stressing now that marriage is something way beyond a contract. It's a covenant, which actually refers to a relationship between the husband and wife, a permanent union of persons capable of knowing and loving each other in God. Okay, here's the fun stuff. Here's where things get really, really, really wacky. And you can get real confused real quick. Many priests and bishops get confused on this stuff and tell people things that are wrong and mess people up and make Protestants out of them or atheists because they've given them bad information. So, all marriages, natural and sacramental, I'm going to talk about that, are presumed valid and binding until evidence to the contrary. That's the basic fundamental principle of marriage, nullity, anything. That's you remember when you're doing geometry, it's like one of the few fundamental proofs that we base almost everything else on. A natural marriage is something that is good, is noble, is fine. It keeps you from sinning. And it's something that the church recognizes. However, it's not sacramental if one of the partners is not baptized. Because remember, baptism is the precursor, the prerequisite for any other sacrament. So, you're naturally married if one of the partners is not baptized. Or both. Sacramental if both partners are baptized. And then this gets really, really confusing because if you have a valid baptism, but you're Baptist or Lutheran, and the other person is validly baptized, it's a sacrament. And the Baptist might say, but I don't believe in sacraments. And we'd say, sorry, we believe that it's a sacrament. So very interesting. You don't have to be Catholic to have a sacramental marriage. Or you can be Catholic and be married to someone who's not baptized and you don't have a sacramental marriage. What's the difference? I would say it's very similar to the act of contrition. When you say, for example, I'm sorry for these sins, not because of just your just punishments, but because I've offended you, O Lord, who are all good and deserving of all my love. Confession works if you're scared. It works if you're scared of hell. That's like the bare kind of minimum, and it works, and you get grace from it. However, how much more noble would it be to be sorry for our sins because we love God so much that we don't want to disappoint Him, and we want to be the best people that we can be. A natural marriage would, I guess, be missing that infusion of grace that defines a sacrament. However, again, it gets really complicated because another foundational principle in our faith is that God has bound Himself to the sacraments, meaning that whenever He says something is sacramental, you're going to get grace from it, it's going to work. He has bound Himself to the sacraments, meaning that He guarantees it. No matter if your priest is kind of shady, if he says the Eucharist right, you've got Eucharist. If he's, just a horrible sinner, but he uses the words for baptism, your baptism works. God has bound Himself to the sacraments, but He's God, and He's not bound by them. God can work outside of that. It's just essentially that sacraments are guaranteed ways of plugging into grace. Which is to say that I know people who are sacramentally married that don't dive into that mystery. And I know people who are naturally married who are great, and their marriage is awesome. So it's something that's kind of confusing But if you understand the framework of how important baptism is, I think it makes a little more sense. Talking a little bit more about the shifting of marriage as kind of covenant from contract. If you look at what Pius the 11th wrote in his encyclical Casti Connubii, very dry, very boring. I read it in class and I was like, ugh. Like, why would anyone want to get married Catholic? This doesn't sound like fun at all. Like, it talks about stuff like, essentially, the only reason is just making kids. That's the only thing that marriage is good for. More kids, more church, more Catholics, more people in the pews. Very, very, I don't know, I wasn't necessarily inspired by it, as you can tell. 30 years later, you start getting a lot more positive shifts in the understanding of marriage, especially with the theology of the body. Theology of the body was mainly sourced by a lot of these presentations that St. John Paul II would give that were like catechetical teaching about married love. And it's interesting, some of the stuff that John Paul II writes would make Pius XI blush. And it's not even 100 years later. How they talk about marriage has shifted so much, which I think is good. It shouldn't be something that's like dour or sad. Okay, so who can marry in the Catholic Church? At least one person has to be Catholic. I get a lot of friends of mine from high school. They're like, can you marry me? Because you're a civil authority. And I can't as a Catholic priest because I have no jurisdiction over people who aren't Catholic. But they're like, we love you, man. It's awesome. Just like dress up like Elvis or something and just do it. And no one has to know. I would know. So I am only allowed to celebrate matrimony for a couple if one of them is a baptized Catholic. They also have to be properly disposed, and that's kind of a loaded term, and I'm going to talk about that. Have fulfilled required preparation, are free from impediments, and have the required intentions. So that's a lot of stuff. That's a lot of requirements. And older priests told me that when they were younger, there was no marriage preparation process. It was like, hey, are you Catholic? Cool. Let me see your paperwork. Are you Catholic? Cool. Let me see your paperwork. All right, let's set a date. That was it. There was no accompanying the couple or anything. Or it was, hey, are you Catholic? Cool. Hey, are you? Wait, you're not? Scandal. Or the priest would say, I'm not going to marry you. They would say that too. Like, I'm not going to marry you. But we have the right to get married. Not by me. I only marry Catholics. So it's hard to fulfill these requirements if you don't get any help to fulfill those requirements, right? So you get to the 1950s, and Rome, and when I talk about Rome, I'm talking about the Supreme Courts of Rome, like the Roman Rota and stuff. They chewed out the bishops of the United States because of so many annulments. We have so many annulments that, are beyond what other nations have. First of all, because we're pretty good at setting up tribunals. Some countries don't have a good infrastructure. Secondly, just a lot of people didn't fulfill these requirements. And one of the canons that you can use for nullity is lack of discretionary judgment. And it was used a lot, like prior to the, 1950s, 1960s. But essentially, that's the argument that there was a mental or emotional incapacity to enter into marriage. Basically, they weren't mature enough to know what they were getting into. That's sort of the catch-all safety net canon. Like, if nothing else works, LDJ. It's kind of like your amoxicillin. Like, whatever. It's the antibiotic that you throw at everything. And Rome was really mad, and they said, you can't just be LDJing everything. Like 99% of your annulments are that the people were not adequately prepared to enter into marriage. You need to do something to adequately prepare them to enter into marriage. And that's where we got the marriage preparation processes from, all of these things like the tests that you take to get to know each other more, the sponsor couples, the classes, the meeting with the priest. is because we have to make sure that all these conditions are met, or it's not a marriage.
What's the difference?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
go ahead.
Between 1 and 4.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, this is more, I'm going to get into this. This is more defined. So properly disposed would be that it's just very generally, that they want to get married, that they believe in it, that they think it's something good, they think it's something that is helpful for them. The required intentions are very specific. And they're very defined, like openness to children, permanence, not infidelity, things like that. So one is kind of a general disposition or character, like if they're disposed towards something, like I'm generally disposed more to H-E-B than another grocery store or something. I tend to think it's a good thing. I tend to be oriented towards it and like it more and disposed towards it. The intentions are things that I actually have to screen for when I'm interviewing them. So like if someone comes to me and I'm like, are you excited about getting married? And they're like, no, I'm just doing it because I'm Hispanic and my mom wants me to do it. Then I would say they're not properly disposed. They may have good intentions, but if they already enter into it like, that's not good. So I'm not going to go through all the impediments because we're getting to an hour and this is the stuff that we'd all fall asleep on in class. But I want to show you this because this is interesting. The church still presumes in 2022 that the great and vast majority of Catholics are going to marry other Catholics. Why not? Because a family should share the same faith, right? It has benefits and things. But the church still assumes in all of its paperwork and all of its processes that it's super, super rare, almost a occurrence that a priest may not even see in his lifetime, that someone could possibly marry someone who's not Catholic. When you read all of the codes and all of the canons and stuff, it's like, in the case of this emergency, these are the things that are going to happen. They didn't expect that the great majority of marriages would be between Catholics and non-Catholics. And you see this in the structure of how this works. So for a Catholic to marry a non-baptized person, I actually need to write the bishop and ask for a dispensation, which is a formal thing that says, I allow you to break this rule. That's what a dispensation is. The rule is Catholics marry Catholics. And so I have to ask the bishop and give him a reason. And for example, I have to say, Bishop, I think they're going to get married, the Catholic's going to get married outside of the Catholic Church. So there's a danger that they won't receive that sacrament. I think it's good for their children or something. I have to give him a reason why. And if I celebrate that marriage without a dispensation, it's invalid. It doesn't work. It doesn't stick. If I celebrate a marriage without sending in that document, it's not a real marriage. That's how important that is. Also, slightly less intense is a Catholic marrying a baptized non-Catholic. The church is like, at least they're baptized. So you only need permission from the bishop, which is different than a dispensation. The difference between that is I can marry a Catholic and a baptized non-Catholic without getting permission from the bishop, and it's still a valid marriage because they're both baptized. The dispensation is like I don't want to say harsher, but it's a much stronger document that I have to get. And most people don't even know that they have to do that, or that I have to do that. Also, I have to ask the Catholic and inform the Catholic to their duty to raise their child in the faith. And a lot of them don't like that because they're getting married because grandma is Catholic and that's just what you do, but they don't plan on practicing the faith or anything whenever they leave. And I say, I'm sorry, I have to inform you this, and you have to sign that I've informed you that you have a duty to share your faith with your children. And they may be like, I don't know my faith. And I'm like, okay, well, we got to work on that. It took me 9 years to go through seminary. If you already had a degree before you went in, it takes 7 years. 7 years of preparation for my sacrament. And they're lucky if they get 7 months to prepare for their sacrament. So it's a lot. It's a lot that we have to stuff in there. Another impediment would be prior bond. If someone was married at all before, we just have to look at it. We just presume that any marriage is valid unless proven otherwise. One thing that I forgot to mention that is important is the thing that causes people a lot of pain and concern, and they think it's so weird and so strange. Catholic tribunals, well, let me say this. The Catholic Church only has jurisdiction over baptized Catholics. So we can tell baptized Catholics, you need to get married in the church. If a baptized Catholic does not get married in the church, gets married civilly, and then that relationship is broken up, they get a one-page thing called a lack of form, that they disobeyed their bishop and they got married outside of the Catholic Church. They broke the rule. Because they broke the rule, it wasn't a marriage. Okay. Now a Lutheran marries another Lutheran. They're not under the jurisdiction of the Catholic Church. They get married. There's a divorce. One of the people wants an annulment. We have to look at that marriage because if they're wanting to get married to a Catholic, all of a sudden we get jurisdiction over them. And which is so hard because they're like, I'm not even Catholic and I have to go through an annulment process. And we're like, yeah, because you're wanting to get married to a Catholic. Which puts you under what we would call our competency to adjudicate. And it's tough because it's like unfair. So the Catholic did things wrong and gets a one-page form that takes less than 5 minutes. And the Lutheran has to, because they want to get married to a Catholic, go through a 3-year-long formal process of something that they don't even necessarily have any background or belief in. It's tough. A lot of people argue with it. A lot of priests don't like it. But it's the way that our current code is structured. There has to be an openness to children if possible. If someone's getting married at 70 years old or something, I'm not going to ask them, are you open to children? They may have already been open to children. They should be pretty sane. And if they have any kind of personality or psychological issues, typically we'll ask for some kind of statement from a therapist or something that we think that they could enter into marriage with the capacity, the emotional capacity or the mental capacity. They can't have any force or fear, internal or external, so that's your shotgun wedding thing, like you got my daughter pregnant, so you are getting married. Very often, especially in other communities that I've been at, there'll be a girl that's 16 or 17 or something, and we have to separate the couple when we're interviewing them. And I'll say, are you getting married because you're pregnant and your parents are making you get married? And she'll say, yes. And I have to write that down and note that, and makes it a lot easier for her to get an annulment in the future. I can also refuse that marriage knowing that I'm basically simulating a marriage. I'm doing something that is not real, and I'm knowing that it's not real. But priests do this a lot because they don't want the family to fall apart. But that's an invalid marriage if there's any kind of internal or external force or fear that makes you enter into it. Or if you have a condition, like you believe that this person, for example, I'm trying to think of an example of a condition. You marry this person because he says that he's a lawyer and makes a lot of money, and you have 2 kids and you need someone, and that's really important that he's a provider. And then you get married and it's a lie. one of the major conditions for why you want to get married to this person is a lie. And that was essential to the reason why you were attracted to this person and wanted to marry them. That's a tougher one to prove, because it's hard to know what's in someone's mind when they're getting married. So some of these are kind of easier than others and require a lot less work whenever something happens. So this is going back to that question. The intentions that I need to get out of them somehow in marriage prep. The thing that I needed them to say, it's like whenever you go to the airport, you get on a plane, you sit in the exit row, and they're like, I just need you to nod or give me some kind of verbal indication that you have heard the instructions for the exit row. I have to screen them and see, do you believe marriage is permanent? I need you to believe that marriage is permanent. Do you believe in fidelity? And I've had situations before where one of the parties has told me that they are currently unfaithful, but they're getting married because they're Catholic and they want to do the right thing. And I'm like, well, maybe the right thing would be fidelity. But so again, I can't celebrate that marriage, of course, knowing that the person has already exhibited to me that they don't have that intention. If possible, they should be open to children. There have been annulments that have been passed, declarations of nullity, because from the very moment of the marriage, and if the marriage lasted 2 or 3 years, there was never a time that birth control was not practiced. You can actually say that there's no openness to children from the very, very, very beginning, and that can be a ground. Also, if they're both baptized, I try to get out of them some sort of understanding of sacramentality. But it's tough. Again, a lot of these people come in with no knowledge whatever of church stuff, and they're about to enter into this huge enterprise, and I'm tasked in like 7 months, and also a team, like a sponsor couple, to try to somehow get this out of them. It's tough. No wonder why it's hard for so many marriages to stay together, I think, nowadays. So the basic, because this is a common question among canonists, what is the bare minimum I need to get out of a couple in order to in good conscience, let them get married? The barest minimum, and good thing the code answers this. And this has to kind of do with, these are the basic intentions that I need. In order that matrimonial consent, so that's the exchange of vows, the I do to this relationship, it is necessary that the contractants at least not be ignorant that marriage is a permanent society, a permanent grouping between a man and a woman to procreate children. Which is tough, because a lot of people are not interested in children nowadays. Climate change and all that kind of stuff. Children breathe carbon dioxide. So I'm just kidding. It's getting late. But it's tough, because I have to ask them, is there any kind of possibility that in the future you might be open to children? And they're like, no. I'm like, I have to get yes. And they're like, well, then yes. So it's tough. But I would argue that it's within marriage specifically, this desire to be with one person exclusively until death, knowing and believing in that commitment that you can have the ability to share your heart with them and experience safety and security and shelter. Almost any other relationship, someone can bail out on you at any time. But if two people really believe in this and live it well, they can experience a type of intimacy, connection, and being known that doesn't exist in any other form or commitment. So, marriage prep. I want to set those intentions, like I said. I want to make sure that they can tell me the bare minimum of what marriage is. That it's faithful, openness to children, and permanent. That's what I want. I want to make sure that the couple knows each other so that there's no error concerning a quality of a person. And that's that impediment that I mentioned before. Meaning, you got to know your spouse at least a little bit. You have to know them a little bit. That's why you have the premarital test, is so that you can go, oh, wow, I didn't know this about you. And if something becomes clear, we can either talk about it or put this on pause or pump the brakes a little bit. I want to make sure the consent is as free as possible, that there's no pressure, no force or fear. When they're standing up in front of the altar, I need them to say yes, sober. I've had to stop weddings because one of the parties was drunk, like just totally drunk and like stumbling over, and they're not in right mind when they're exchanging that consent, so I can't marry them. And then they're mad and they're like, well, we're not going to pay you, man. And I'm like, well, that's great because I'm not doing your wedding. All right, almost done. So, this is what a church should be doing according to Canon 1063. This is the ideal. We should be often preaching and teaching through the use of media like Ryan or our homilies about marriage. And that's challenging. I don't know the last time I've given a homily on marriage, except at a wedding. But and Sunday. Like when is a teenager ever going to hear the church's teaching on marriage if they don't go to classes or anything? It's a challenge. I need to one day say some of this stuff in a homily. Not all of this, but some of this, so that they know, because they're losing their connection to what marriage is. Preparation should be personal. The priest should kind of sort of know the couple, at least. Unfortunately, in large parishes, the priests often don't know the couple. Like that was me at Emmaus. I was like, Joe, do you take Sally? And he's like, my name's Jeff, Father. And I'm like, fine, Jeff, do you take... I got the wrong paper on my way. So that's not good. The liturgy should be nice. And we should be taking care of families after they get married, instead of just dumping them and saying, good luck. Which we often do. So this is something brand new, hot off the press. Pope Francis, on June 15th of this year, put out a document in Italian and Spanish about how he wants marriage prep to change and be different, which of course we're looking at as priests and going, oh no, like more work. But he wants it to be more like RCIA, where there's a group of people that are walking with this couple as they're discerning. And he wants it to be like from a year out, we start working with them. And then we move closer and closer and closer to them. And then afterwards, like in RCIA, there's a period called mystagogy, where you're brand new as a Catholic and you continue meeting together and growing together. And so he wants something like that, like a mystagogy of marriage where married couples continue together. This was translated into English last week on October the 4th, which means that the bishops are going to get together, probably write something about it. So like 10 years from now, we'll probably have a pathway forward, knowing how things work in the Catholic Church. But it's interesting. That's just what I was saying. The third part would be marriage mystagogy, a post-wedding formation phase involving at least 2 to 3 years of accompanying couples through their first steps of married life. So there's a program that I don't use, but I will probably use if I ever become a pastor of a large parish. I didn't need it when I was at the small parish, but it's neat. Like a year after the wedding, like a reminder comes up on your computer to email the couple and ask them how they're doing and things like that. 6 months after you celebrate a funeral, it pops up and says, can you call the spouse and just see how they're doing and stuff. And it really helps you because that stuff just gets lost. The impetus behind doing this, that Pope Francis says, is that the number of marriages in the church have declined 70% since 1969. So to dive down into that, and it's kind of old data, it's 2014. But the annual number of marriages have dropped from 426,300 in 1969 in the United States to under 148,000, while more people are identifying as being Catholic. So they're just going somewhere else. So how do we make Catholic marriage something that is awesome, that inspires people, that makes people want to do it? I talked to this priest, his name's Father Matthew DeGant, and he says that what he does at his parish is all the newly married couples who are interested in this continue hanging out. They go to dinners or dances or wine and cheese nights, and he does a little talk, or someone who's married may do another talk on just 15 or 30 minutes of conflict resolution, or this is my life and my struggles in marriage. Sometimes older couples will come and hang out with these younger couples, and they maintain those friendships. All right, one last thing that I just think is a neat little note, and then we can do some questions, and I know it's late, so I'll stay around too if you want to ask some one-on-one questions. I know this is a lot. It's kind of like when we're going through the saints. It's whirlwind, but it might send something up into your mind where you go, oh, that's interesting, and I want to Google this or learn more about it. So this is just my theory. I don't know if this is exactly church teaching or if it's heresy or beresy, as my professor used to say it. But people are really, really concerned about this, and they'll say, when I die and go to heaven, what's that going to be like? What's my relationship going to be like? What if I had like 7 husbands or 7 wives or something, and I love them all? Will we see each other, or will we all just be so focused on God that we won't care about each other? They're really kind of concerned about this, which I think is good. And it comes from this line where the Sadducees are talking about the resurrection, and Jesus says, when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. It's a very interesting line. But I think that Jesus was simply meeting this objection that the Sadducees were talking about. The Sadducees, unlike the Pharisees, did not believe in the resurrection. That's why they were sad, you see. So that's how you remember that. But we do live after death. We have spiritual bodies, glorified bodies. In heaven, there will be no more death or birth. There'll just be existence. But I do think we carry everything in this life forward, and it's intensified, and God's going to keep us close to our loved ones. That one is even easier to answer than when kids say, well, I see my pet in heaven. That's a really tough one to answer. Because Thomas Aquinas was so mean. Like someone said, like, will I see my pet in heaven? And he was like, no, of course not. They're not a rational soul. They're just animals, you know. And like all these kids are like crying and stuff. And so I don't necessarily go there, but I do say, like, you know, one of the ways you can sort of help a child that's kind of struggling with that is say, you're going to be happy when you're in heaven, you know. And if part of that happiness is being around, you know, your animal, awesome. But they don't know yet that they will be so focused on God and His love and stuff like that, that will pretty much take most of their capacity. But I do think that these special relationships that we have on earth in some sense do continue in heaven. But if you have any thoughts about that line, that's been one I've always struggled with. And I'd love to get your insight on that. And with that, thank you. It's a lot, I know. Yeah. Very intense topic, I know.